He was just a Navy SEAL hoping to enjoy a quiet leave at his family's old cabin. Then one rainy spring night, someone left 3 newborn German Shepherd puppies on his porch. Wyatt Mercer opened the door and froze. 3 tiny puppies, soaked from the rain, curled tightly against one another. Far too young to be out there alone. He wasn't a veterinarian. He didn't even know if he was doing everything right. So he carried them inside. 4 days later, 2 strangers knocked on his door asking about 3 missing puppies. That was the moment Wyatt realized. Nothing about that rainy night had been an accident. Before we begin, tell us what city you're watching from today. We'd love to know how far this story travels. 17 days in Africa had taught Wyatt Mercer how fast silence could disappear. Back home in the Tennessee mountains, he hoped it would stay. He was 35, a Navy SEAL on short leave after a hostage rescue near the Horn of Africa, the kind of mission that looked clean on paper and stayed messy inside a man's head. American engineers had come home alive. His team had returned before sunrise. The report would fit inside a folder, but Wyatt carried pieces of it in places paperwork could not reach. So he drove east instead of going anywhere loud. His old pickup rolled past Townsend, Tennessee, then climbed a narrow road toward the cabin his parents had left behind. Early spring had softened the Great Smoky Mountains without making them predictable. Morning sun warmed the pasture behind the house, then afternoon rain turned the red clay driveway slick and dark. Dogwood blossoms opened beside the porch like small white flags. The cabin was quiet enough to hear himself breathe. Wyatt spent the first day repairing a split-rail fence near the old horse shed, clearing leaves from the gutter and wiping dust from family photographs in the hallway. He did not talk much, even alone. He had learned that some kinds of silence were better left undisturbed, especially in a house that still held his mother's blue mixing bowl and his father's work gloves by the back door. By the second night, rain had settled over the valley. It came hard for nearly an hour, drumming against the tin roof, washing pine pollen from the porch rail, and filling the low places in the gravel drive. Then, just after midnight, it stopped all at once. Only the slow drip from the eaves remained, each drop striking the wooden steps with a small, patient sound. Wyatt stood in the kitchen making coffee he did not need. That was when he heard it. At first, he thought it was the house settling after the storm. Old cabins had their own voices. Swollen boards, ticking pipes, wind sliding through seams in the walls. He lifted the mug halfway and paused, listening beyond the hum of the refrigerator and the soft click of the heater. The sound came again, thin, small, almost gone. Wyatt set the mug down and crossed the room. His body moved before his mind had finished naming the sound, the old training still alive beneath the flannel shirt and muddy boots. At the front door, he stopped with his hand on the latch and listened one more time. Something outside was trying to be heard. He opened the door. Cool spring air pushed into the cabin, carrying the smell of wet leaves and red clay. The porch light cast a yellow circle over the steps, the doormat, and a damp old towel tucked near the railing. For a moment, Wyatt saw nothing unusual. Then the towel shifted. He crouched slowly. 3 German Shepherd puppies lay pressed together inside the wet cloth, so small they barely looked old enough to belong to the world. Their coats were dark with tan markings at the paws and faces, their eyes just beginning to open. They were quiet, shivering from the rain, curled so tightly against one another that Wyatt could not tell where one tiny body ended and the next began. He looked toward the driveway, then toward the woods. No headlights waited beyond the trees. No person stepped from the dark. No mother dog paced the edge of the yard, anxious and watching. Only the rainwater kept falling from the roof. Wyatt slid both hands beneath the towel and lifted them carefully. They weighed almost nothing. One puppy made a faint sound against his palm, and he brought the bundle close to his chest before the night air could steal more warmth from them. "All right," he murmured. "You're coming in." Inside, he moved with the calm of a man who had been trained to act while fear waited its turn. He spread a thick towel on the rug near the electric heater, then dried the puppies slowly, working from their heads to their small paws. He did not place them too close to the heat. A body that had been cold too long needed warmth to return gently, not all at once. He found a cardboard box in the mudroom and lined it with a fleece blanket. Then he called the emergency veterinary number in Maryville. The veterinarian who answered sounded tired but steady. She told him to keep them warm, feed only tiny amounts, avoid cow's milk, and use puppy formula if he had any. Wyatt repeated each instruction out loud, writing notes on the back of an old feed receipt with a carpenter's pencil. In the pantry, he found a sealed can of puppy milk replacer from a church supply drive months earlier. For once, something forgotten had waited for the right night. He mixed the formula warm, tested it against his wrist, and used a small syringe from a first aid kit to feed them one careful drop at a time. The largest pup swallowed first, stubborn even in weakness. The second leaned into Wyatt's thumb as if touch mattered as much as food. The smallest took longer, mouth uncertain, body tucked low in the blanket. Wyatt waited. At last the smallest swallowed once. His breath left him slowly. The clock above the stove moved past 2:40 a.m. Outside, the mountain stayed dark and wet, and the creek somewhere below the pasture kept moving over stone. Inside, Wyatt sat on the floor with his back against the sofa, the cardboard box beside his knee, and the feeding syringe resting in a cup near his boot. He had expected the cabin to feel empty. It didn't. Every 2 hours, he woke to check them. He touched 2 fingers lightly against each puppy's side to feel the rise and fall of breath. He adjusted the blanket, cleaned their little faces, and kept the box half on the heating pad so they could shift away if they grew too warm. A man trusted with missions that crossed oceans now measured the night in spoonfuls of formula. Near dawn, the smallest puppy stirred. It pushed its head against the side of Wyatt's hand and stayed there, quiet and warm beneath his fingers. The gesture was small enough that another man might have missed it. Wyatt didn't. His mouth softened into the first real smile he had worn since leaving the mission. A quiet one. Over the next few days, the cabin began to change around them. Towels hung over chairbacks. Feeding notes covered a page on the kitchen counter. Wyatt's coffee went cold more often than it got finished, and the old blue mixing bowl became a place for washing tiny feeding tools instead of holding biscuit dough. The puppies began to show themselves in small ways. The largest always pushed forward when Wyatt reached into the box, not strong enough to protect anyone yet, but willing to try. If a door creaked or a branch scraped the window, he lifted his head first. Wyatt named him Boone. The second searched for warmth wherever he could find it. He nudged into Wyatt's sleeve, crawled toward his boot, and complained softly whenever he woke alone. Wyatt called him Harper. The smallest watched longer than the others. He sniffed the blanket, the edge of the box, Wyatt's fingers, and the air itself before settling down. He was slower, quieter, and strangely careful. Wyatt named him Briar. By the 4th morning, sunlight returned to the valley. Mist lifted from the pasture, and drops of rain still clung to the dogwood blossoms beside the porch. Wyatt stood in the kitchen, warming another small bottle of formula, while Boone, Harper, and Briar shifted together near the heater. He still did not know where they had come from. For the moment, he only knew they were here. 3 small lives. 3 names written in pencil. 3 reasons to keep the house warm. For a few brief days, Wyatt Mercer allowed himself to believe the hardest part would be helping them survive the first week. But kindness, once it opens a door, sometimes invites a truth no one is ready to face. 4 days passed and the little cabin slowly found a new rhythm. Morning sunlight spilled across the kitchen floor, through windows still dotted with rain from the night before. Beyond the porch, fresh leaves shimmered under the breeze rolling down from the Smokies, and somewhere across the valley, a church bell drifted softly through the clean spring air. The puppies were changing faster than Wyatt expected. Boone had already decided that every unfamiliar sound deserved his attention. Whenever the floor creaked or a truck rumbled along the county road, his tiny head would lift before the others even noticed. Harper had different priorities. If Wyatt stood up, Harper wanted to know where he was going. If Wyatt disappeared into another room, the little pup answered with soft whimpers until familiar footsteps returned. Being close seemed more important than food. Briar remained the quiet one. He spent long moments studying the edge of the cardboard box, sniffing blankets, shoes, chair legs, even the cool morning air drifting through the screen door, before deciding whether something was worth exploring. Each puppy carried a different curiosity. Wyatt encouraged all of it. Following the veterinarian's advice, he gently handled their paws, ears, and tiny mouths for a few moments every day, letting them become comfortable with human touch long before fear had a chance to settle in. He spoke to them constantly while preparing formula or changing blankets, never raising his voice, never rushing. He wasn't raising future working dogs. He was simply trying to give 3 abandoned puppies the kind of beginning every living creature deserved. Late that morning, he climbed a ladder beside the porch to replace a section of loose gutter damaged during the winter. The metal gave one final groan before sliding back into place. Wyatt tightened the last screw, stepped down onto the gravel driveway, and admired the repair with the quiet satisfaction that came from finishing something simple. Then he heard tires. A dark gray SUV rolled slowly onto the driveway, its wheels crunching over wet gravel before stopping several yards from the porch. Wyatt wiped his hands on a shop towel. 2 men stepped out. Both wore outdoor jackets with embroidered-looking rescue patches across the chest, khaki work pants, and hiking boots clean enough to suggest they had spent very little time on muddy mountain roads. They smiled before either of them spoke. "Morning," the older one called. "Sorry to bother you." Wyatt returned a polite nod. "No trouble." The man introduced himself as a volunteer with a regional animal rescue organization. According to his story, 3 newborn German Shepherd puppies had disappeared after one of their transport vehicles experienced mechanical trouble several days earlier. "We've been checking every property around the area," he explained while offering a business card. "Someone mentioned your cabin sits pretty far back from the road." Wyatt accepted the card. The paper felt unusually glossy. "Have you happened to see any puppies?" the younger man asked. Wyatt shook his head almost casually. "Can't say I have." The conversation remained surprisingly comfortable. Neither man pressured him. Neither insisted on searching the property. Neither sounded impatient. That, more than anything, kept Wyatt alert. His training had taught him a lesson years ago. People trying too hard to appear ordinary often practiced it beforehand. While they spoke, Wyatt noticed details most people would have ignored. The logo on both jackets wasn't stitched into the fabric. It had been heat-pressed. Their boots were spotless except for a faint white powder caught around the soles, more like crushed limestone than the red clay common around Townsend. The business card listed no local office, no website, only a phone number. The younger man's eyes wandered toward the windows twice during the conversation before returning to Wyatt's face. None of those details proved anything. Together, they refused to leave his mind. After another minute, the older man smiled again. "Well, thanks for your time. If you happen to see them, we'd really appreciate a call." "You bet." Wyatt slipped the business card into the breast pocket of his flannel shirt before offering the men one last polite smile. "I hope you find them." The 2 men thanked him once more and turned toward the SUV. For a moment, Wyatt thought the visit was over. Then Harper woke up. Still tucked inside his blanket near the living room window, the tiny puppy stretched clumsily and let out 2 soft little barks. Yip, yip. The sounds barely filled the room. Outside, however, the morning had become almost perfectly still. Both men stopped walking. The younger one turned slowly. "You got a dog in there?" Everything seemed to pause. Wyatt reacted before the silence had time to grow uncomfortable. He spun halfway toward the open doorway and frowned with perfect annoyance. "Oh, come on." He raised his voice toward the kitchen. "That stray cat again? How many times do I have to tell you to stay out of my kitchen?" He sighed dramatically, rubbing the back of his neck before looking toward the visitors with an embarrassed grin. "Sorry about that. There's this neighborhood cat that treats my back door like an all-you-can-eat buffet. If I leave it cracked open for 5 minutes, she thinks she owns the place." The younger man frowned. "That cat sounds different." Wyatt laughed. "Believe me, she's different," he shrugged. "My neighbor keeps saying one of these days she's going to start charging me rent." For a second, nobody spoke. Then the older man chuckled. "Guess every mountain's got one." The tension dissolved as naturally as it had appeared. The younger man smiled, though only slightly, and climbed into the passenger seat. The SUV backed slowly down the driveway before disappearing behind a line of maple trees still dripping from last night's rain. Wyatt remained on the porch long after the engine faded into the distance. Only then did he close the front door. The screen door clicked shut behind Wyatt, sealing the cabin in quiet once again. For several long seconds, he simply stood there with one hand resting on the doorknob, listening until even the fading sound of the SUV disappeared beyond the trees. Only then did he let out a slow breath. Inside the cardboard box, Harper was still blinking sleepily toward the doorway, as if wondering why everyone had suddenly stopped talking. Wyatt walked over and crouched beside him. The little puppy struggled awkwardly across the blanket before finally reaching Wyatt's hand. A tiny pink tongue brushed against one finger. Wyatt smiled. "You almost gave us away, little man." Harper answered by pressing his tiny nose against Wyatt's thumb before curling back into the blanket, perfectly content now that the familiar voice had returned. The moment lasted only a few seconds. It was enough. Boone had already fallen asleep again, one paw stretched protectively across Briar's shoulder despite being barely old enough to stand. Briar, however, remained awake. The smallest puppy slowly crawled toward Wyatt's boots, nose twitching as though something invisible had caught his attention. Wyatt reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out the business card. The glossy paper reflected a strip of afternoon sunlight spilling across the kitchen table. Before Wyatt could even lay it down, Briar reached it first. The tiny puppy sniffed along one edge, paused, then sniffed again longer this time. He didn't bark, he didn't whine. Instead, he lifted his head and stared toward the eastern windows overlooking the woods beyond the pasture. Wyatt followed the puppy's gaze. Nothing moved outside except a pair of blue jays hopping between branches. Still, he found himself looking a little longer than necessary. He shook the thought away. "Puppies don't solve mysteries," he muttered quietly. "But sometimes they notice things people don't." The words surprised even him. Late that afternoon, clouds drifted back across the mountains, dimming the sunlight without bringing rain. Wyatt carried a ladder to the shed and finished replacing the last section of damaged gutter, but his attention wandered more than once toward the gravel driveway. The visitors had been too polite, too prepared, too careful. Experience had taught him that real conversations usually contained small imperfections. That one hadn't. After putting the tools away, Wyatt returned inside and downloaded the recordings from the cabin's security cameras. The footage showed exactly what he remembered. The gray SUV, the two visitors, the conversation on the porch, nothing unusual. He almost closed the laptop. Almost. Instead, he replayed the video frame by frame. Years spent studying surveillance footage overseas had taught him patience. Tiny details often mattered more than obvious ones. Frame after frame rolled past, then he stopped. As the younger man turned back after hearing Harper's little bark, his jacket collar shifted just enough to expose part of a tattoo behind his neck. Only a fraction, the outline of a wolf's head. Wyatt leaned closer to the screen. He had seen something remarkably similar years earlier during a joint intelligence briefing involving organized trafficking groups operating through remote mountain regions. He couldn't remember the full report, only the symbol, and the warning attached to it. His fingers rested quietly on the keyboard. A coincidence remained possible. Assumptions got people hurt. He refused to make them. Still, instincts earned over 15 years rarely spoke without reason. Outside, the afternoon wind rustled softly through the dogwood tree beside the porch. Inside, Boone sighed in his sleep. Harper twitched one tiny ear. Briar continued watching the business card lying on the table as though it carried a scent Wyatt could not detect. The cabin felt strangely different now, not dangerous, just observed. Wyatt picked up his phone. He scrolled through old contacts before stopping on one name. Eric Sullivan. DEA, the two of them had crossed paths several times during joint operations years earlier. Wyatt trusted Eric for one simple reason. Eric never chased conclusions, only evidence. Wyatt attached 3 security images, one close-up of the SUV, one showing both men. One enlarged frame capturing part of the tattoo beneath the younger visitor's collar. Below the photographs, he typed only one sentence. "I don't know what I'm looking at yet, but my gut tells me those 3 puppies didn't end up on my porch by accident." He pressed send. The cabin returned to silence. For nearly half an hour, nothing happened. Wyatt washed feeding syringes, changed blankets, prepared another bottle. Outside, sunlight slipped lower across the pasture while shadows stretched beneath the trees. His phone vibrated against the kitchen counter. "Eric Sullivan," Wyatt answered immediately. He expected questions. Instead, Eric's voice arrived unusually calm. Too calm. "Wyatt." A brief pause filled the line. "Don't let those puppies out of your sight. Another second passed. I'm on my way. The next morning arrived, bright and clear, as though the rain had never touched the mountains. Sunlight filtered through fresh maple leaves, scattering patches of gold across Wyatt's porch, while mist drifted lazily above the pasture. Boone slept with one paw stretched over Harper. Briar sat awake near the window, quietly watching the woods beyond the fence. At exactly 9, an old silver pickup eased into the driveway. Eric Sullivan stepped out wearing faded jeans, hiking boots, and a weathered flannel shirt. Without the DEA windbreaker Wyatt remembered, he looked more like a local handyman than a federal agent. Figured I'd blend in a little better, Eric said, carrying 2 cups of coffee. Wyatt accepted one. Good call. They settled onto the porch swing, while Boone and Harper continued sleeping inside. Briar remained near the window, occasionally lifting his nose whenever Wyatt placed the business card on the table beside him. Eric studied everything without rushing. The security footage, the timestamps, the SUV, the business card, the partial license plate Wyatt had managed to capture before the vehicle disappeared around the bend. None of it could justify a warrant. Together, however, the pieces refused to feel ordinary. Eric tapped the business card lightly. No registered rescue group under this name. I checked last night. I figured you would. Neither man spoke for several seconds. The breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut grass from a neighboring farm, while a woodpecker echoed somewhere deeper in the trees. Finally, Eric looked toward the eastern ridge. You notice anything else? Wyatt nodded toward the window. Briar has. The little puppy shuffled closer the moment Wyatt picked up the card. He sniffed it carefully, paused, then turned once again toward the same stretch of woods east of the cabin. Eric watched without smiling. You think he remembers the scent? I don't know. Wyatt slipped the card back into his pocket, but I know he's been doing that every time. Eric nodded thoughtfully. Puppies remember more than people give them credit for. For a moment, the conversation drifted elsewhere. They talked about military dogs, scent association, and how young puppies could retain familiar smells long before formal training ever began. The silence that followed felt heavier. Then Eric stood. I want to look at the old forestry roads. Wyatt already had his truck keys. By early afternoon, they were winding through forgotten logging roads that no longer appeared on most navigation apps. Spring had reclaimed much of the forest. Ferns crowded both sides of the trail, and fallen branches forced Wyatt to steer around more than once. Several roads simply ended beneath years of brush. Then Eric noticed fresh tire marks. Stop. Wyatt backed the truck several feet before both men climbed out. The tracks crossed soft ground still damp from the previous night's rain. Wide tires. Heavy vehicle. Recent. They followed the impressions until the trail curved toward a rusted steel gate, leaning half open between thick stands of oak. According to an old forestry marker nearby, the road had officially been closed years earlier. Eric crouched beside the tracks. Somebody's using it, recently. Neither man crossed the gate, not yet. Without probable cause, they had no reason to push farther. Eric photographed everything before marking the location on his GPS. As they drove away, Wyatt looked once in the rearview mirror. The abandoned road disappeared beneath the trees almost immediately. Less than 5 miles beyond that gate, another young man was finishing his morning chores. Ethan Cross emptied fresh water into several kennel bowls before quietly closing each gate behind him. He was 21, thin, soft-spoken. 3 months earlier, after his father's long battle with cancer had left the family drowning in medical debt, Ethan had accepted what he believed would be simple work, caring for dogs and delivering feed. The truth revealed itself slowly. The dogs weren't being raised for families. Some were treated as tools. Others were treated even worse. Each week became harder to justify than the last. 4 nights earlier, Ethan had watched one exhausted German Shepherd mother struggle to reach her newborn puppies while chained inside a crowded kennel. He waited until everyone else had gone inside. Then he wrapped the 3 smallest puppies inside an old towel, loaded them into his pickup, and drove through the mountains beneath steady rain. He never considered taking them to the sheriff's office. Fear stopped him. Instead, he remembered hearing local people talk about a former Navy SEAL living alone outside Townsend, someone known for helping injured wildlife and volunteering with rescue groups after floods. Ethan had never met Wyatt Mercer. He simply hoped the stories were true. Leaving the puppies on that porch had felt less like a plan, and more like a prayer. Now everything was unraveling. Earlier that morning, his supervisor had stormed through the kennels demanding answers about the missing puppies. Ethan kept his eyes down. He said nothing, but for the first time since taking the job, he understood something with painful clarity. Time was running out. A brief afternoon shower swept across the mountains before disappearing as quickly as it had arrived. By sunset, Wyatt and Eric were back at the cabin. The puppies greeted them with sleepy movements from their blanket near the heater. Harper crawled toward Wyatt's boots. Boone yawned. Briar quietly watched the door as though waiting for someone else to arrive. Eric slipped his phone back into his pocket. "I'll start digging into those license plate fragments tonight." Wyatt nodded. Neither of them had enough evidence to accuse anyone. Neither of them intended to guess. But both men knew they had stepped much closer to the truth than either of them had expected. Some secrets are uncovered by evidence. Others begin with a single choice made by someone desperately trying to do the right thing before it's too late. 2 days later, the quiet around Wyatt Mercer's cabin no longer felt peaceful. It felt watched. The DEA did not move quickly, and Eric Sullivan made sure of that. Satellite images, traffic cameras, drone footage, and old property records all began pointing toward the same place. An abandoned limestone quarry hidden beyond the closed forestry road east of Wyatt's land. On paper, the site had been inactive for 8 years. In reality, trucks had been coming and going after dark. By late afternoon, Eric returned to the cabin with a small folder, a tired face, and the kind of silence that arrived before bad news. Wyatt stood at the kitchen counter warming formula while Boone, Harper, and Briar shifted softly in their box beside the heater. Outside, sunlight moved across the pasture, clean and gentle, as if the world had not just revealed another ugly thing beneath its surface. Eric placed the folder on the table. "FBI is joining," he said. Wyatt looked up. "That bad?" Eric didn't answer right away. He opened the folder and slid one photograph across the table. It showed the quarry from above. Gray stone walls half swallowed by spring growth, a cluster of sheds near the center, and long rows of narrow shapes behind a sheet metal building. Kennels. Wyatt stared at the image longer than he needed to. The room went quiet. "They're watching one more night," Eric said. "Need to confirm how many people are inside, how many dogs, whether anyone's armed." Wyatt nodded once. That part made sense. What did not sit easily in his chest was the waiting. That night, he went with Eric as an outside consultant, nothing more. They parked far from the site and walked through damp brush under a moon hidden by moving clouds. The air smelled of moss, wet stone, and old machinery. Somewhere below them, a generator hummed faintly from inside the quarry. They took position along a ridge above the property. From there, the whole place lay beneath them, like a secret someone had built in the wrong corner of God's country. Men moved between the sheds with flashlights. A truck backed toward a loading area. Metal gates clicked. Dogs answered with low, uneven sounds that rose and fell through the hollow. Wyatt watched through binoculars. He had seen weapons caches, hostile compounds, and houses where fear lived in the walls. Yet what held his eyes longest was not the truck, not the men, not the covered packages being moved from one shed to another. It was the row of kennels at the far end. Dozens of dogs stood behind wire, some paced, some sat still. A few only watched. At the last kennel, a German Shepherd mother lifted her head every time a recorded puppy sound played from a small speaker near the handler's table. She tried to stand, then settled back down, not from surrender, but from exhaustion. She did not bark, she listened. Wyatt lowered the binoculars. His jaw tightened. Eric glanced over but said nothing. Some moments did not need a witness to explain them. Years earlier, Wyatt had followed orders that left men behind until extraction could return. He had known the reasons. He had understood the math. Understanding had never made the memory lighter. Below the ridge, the German Shepherd mother raised her head again. This time, Wyatt did not look away. By 4:40 the next morning, the operation began. No sirens tore through the trees. No wild charge announced the raid. The teams moved in through mist and gray light, sealing roads first, cutting off exits, keeping the kennel side away from the center of the arrests. The goal was simple enough to say and difficult enough to matter. Secure the people, protect the animals, preserve the evidence. Then the loudspeaker broke the morning. Federal agents, stay where you are, show your hands. The quarry erupted into movement. A door slammed. Someone shouted. One man tried to run toward the tree line and was stopped before he reached the slope. Another dropped something beside a truck and went to his knees with his hands raised. Wyatt stayed near Eric behind the first line, exactly where he had agreed to be. He was not there to play hero. He was there because he knew the land. When the kennel area was cleared, Eric gave him a sharp nod. Wyatt moved with 2 animal control officers toward the far row. The dogs inside were frightened but not wild. Most pressed back at first, uncertain whether the open doors meant kindness or another order they did not understand. Wyatt lowered his voice. Easy. One dog stepped forward, then another. At the eastern line of kennels, a young man stood with both hands raised, face pale under the morning mist. Ethan Cross. Wyatt did not know his name yet, only that he looked too young for the place he was standing in and too tired to pretend he belonged there. A deputy moved to cuff him. Ethan did not pull away. He only turned his head toward the last kennel. Please, he said, voice breaking on the word. Save the mother first. Wyatt stopped. The words landed harder than a confession. Not because they made Ethan innocent, they didn't. But they revealed something still alive in him. Wyatt walked to the last kennel and crouched. The German Shepherd mother stood slowly, her body tense, eyes fixed on him with the terrible patience of an animal that had learned not to hope too quickly. He opened the latch and waited instead of reaching in. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then she stepped forward. One paw, then another. When her nose touched Wyatt's sleeve, he felt her tremble once and steady herself. Behind him, Ethan lowered his head. The cuff clicked shut around his wrist. By sunrise, the quarry was secured. Evidence teams moved through the buildings. Dogs were carried, guided, or gently lifted into transport crates. The German Shepherd mother went last, not because she was forgotten, but because Wyatt stayed beside her until she was ready to leave. As the first transport van pulled away, the mist began lifting from the quarry walls. Wyatt looked toward Ethan, now seated near a patrol vehicle with a blanket over his shoulders. The boy had made terrible choices, and one that had saved lives. That was the part Wyatt would carry with him. Some rescues begin with force. This one had begun days earlier when a frightened young man placed 3 puppies on a stranger's porch and hoped mercy would answer the door. The quarry grew quiet long before the paperwork did. Over the following days, 23 dogs were transported to the Tennessee Animal Recovery Center, where veterinarians, behavior specialists, and volunteers worked side by side from sunrise until evening. Some animals needed medical treatment. Others simply needed time. Fresh water, clean bedding, regular meals, and patient voices slowly replaced months of uncertainty. Recovery came one small step at a time. Some dogs accepted gentle hands within hours. Others stayed near the back of their kennels, watching every movement before deciding whether trust was worth risking again. Wyatt visited whenever Eric called to say another group had settled in. He rarely spoke much. Most days, he simply helped clean runs, carried food buckets, or sat quietly outside a kennel until a frightened dog decided it was safe to come closer. No one asked him to do it. He came because he wanted to. One warm afternoon near the end of the week, a veterinary technician stepped outside and found Wyatt repairing a loose fence beside the rehabilitation yard. "They're ready." Wyatt wiped his hands on his jeans and followed her. Inside a large enclosed pasture, Boone, Harper, and Briar waited together near a shaded corner. They were already stronger than they had been only days earlier. Boone stood confidently in front of his siblings. Harper wandered toward every familiar person he recognized. Briar paused often, studying each new sound before taking another careful step. Then another gate opened. The German Shepherd mother walked inside. She moved slowly, her body still thin from neglect, stopping every few yards as though making certain what she saw was real. Boone noticed her first. His ears lifted. Harper tilted his head. Briar stood perfectly still. Nobody said a word. The mother lowered her nose toward Boone. Then Harper, then Briar. She touched each puppy gently before resting her forehead against them. The 3 little puppies pressed close beneath her chest as naturally as if they had never spent a single night apart. The only sound came from birds singing somewhere beyond the fence. Even several DEA agents standing nearby quietly looked away, giving the family a moment that belonged to no one else. Wyatt remained where he was. Some reunions deserved distance. The investigation continued for months. Financial records, transportation logs, and testimony from multiple witnesses slowly uncovered the remaining members of the trafficking network. Ethan Cross cooperated from the beginning. He identified storage locations, explained how shipments had been organized, and helped investigators recover evidence that otherwise might never have been found. The court recognized the difference between participation and leadership. Ethan was still held responsible for the work he had done. Actions carried consequences, even when driven by fear or desperation. But the judge also considered the choices Ethan had made after recognizing the truth. Saving the puppies, cooperating fully, and helping protect the remaining dogs. Instead of a lengthy prison sentence, Ethan entered a supervised rehabilitation and vocational training program while continuing to assist investigators. Justice had not ignored his mistakes. Neither had it ignored his courage. Wyatt never attended the hearing. He believed some moments belonged to the people living them. A week after sentencing, Ethan received a single envelope without a return address. Inside was one handwritten note. A person's life isn't measured by the day they made their worst mistake. It's measured by the day they chose to make their next decision a better one. Wyatt Ethan folded the letter carefully before placing it inside the only book his father had left him. Months passed. Summer replaced spring across the Tennessee hills. Boone became the companion of an elderly couple who had recently lost their longtime shepherd. They lived on a small farm outside Maryville, where wide fields and quiet mornings suited his protective nature. Harper found a different calling. Mrs. Hazel Callahan, the owner of a small grocery store in Townsend, officially adopted him after volunteering at the recovery center. Customers quickly learned that every visit included a cheerful puppy waiting near the front entrance, greeting children, retirees, delivery drivers, and anyone willing to stop long enough for a friendly scratch behind the ears. The whole town simply called him the greeter. Briar stayed exactly where he belonged, at Wyatt's cabin. As Briar grew older, Wyatt enrolled him in a professional working dog evaluation program. Not because he wanted another military dog, but because he wanted Briar to develop confidence, discipline, and the ability to help people if the day ever came. There would be no battlefield waiting for him. Wyatt intended to keep it that way. Late one afternoon near the end of spring, a brief shower drifted across the valley before sunshine returned almost immediately. Water still shimmered on the grass when Wyatt stepped onto the porch carrying a smooth wooden ball he had carved from an old piece of oak. Briar waited at the bottom of the steps, tail wagging, eyes fixed on Wyatt. Without a word, Wyatt tossed the ball toward the open pasture. Briar sprinted after it with joyful determination, disappearing through patches of golden light before racing back across the field. Halfway home, he stopped, turned, and looked back at Wyatt as though making sure he was still there. Wyatt smiled. "I'm not going anywhere." Briar bounded the rest of the way and dropped the wooden ball beside Wyatt's boots before settling quietly at his feet. The breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut hay from a neighboring farm. Somewhere beyond the hills, church bells marked the hour. Wyatt rested one hand on Briar's head and watched the sunlight spread across the valley. He had completed missions that ended with medals. Others had ended with reports sealed inside government archives. But the ones he remembered most had never been about victory. They had been about trust. Sometimes the greatest rescue wasn't saving a life. Sometimes it was helping a life believe in people again. One thing this story keeps bringing me back to is how rarely healing arrives all at once. Most of the time, it comes quietly. It looks like a warm blanket spread on a cold floor, a handwritten note that asks for nothing in return, or a dog finally closing its eyes because it no longer has to stay afraid. Those moments are easy to overlook, but they often change a life more than the loud ones ever do. I also appreciate that this story reminds us people are complicated. Some make painful mistakes. Some carry burdens we never see. And sometimes the bravest thing a person does isn't pretending they never failed. It's choosing to do one good thing while they still can. I like to believe that God often works through those small decisions, through ordinary people who simply decide to show kindness when no one is watching. This story is fictional, but the emotions behind it, the need for mercy, second chances, and someone willing to care, are experiences many of us recognize in our own lives. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever seen an act of kindness change someone's path or perhaps your own? Feel free to share your memories, prayers, or reflections in the comments. And if you enjoy grounded stories about courage, loyalty, and quiet hope, I'd be grateful if you'd like this video and subscribe for more. As for me, I'll probably remember the image of Briar stopping in the grass, looking back just once to make sure Wyatt was still there. Somehow, that small glance feels like the kind of trust we all hope to find before another ordinary day comes to an end.